of the faction that supports their actions. Which brings us to freshman Congressman Madison Cawthorn, a Republican from North Carolina. This past Sunday, he came out and lied about the election being rigged, warned of violence and bloodshed if these non-existent rigged elections continue.
I'll tell you, anybody who tells you that Joe Biden was dutifully elected is lying.
If our election systems continue to be rigged and continue to be stolen, it's going to lead to one place, and it's bloodshed. And I will tell you, as much as I am willing to defend our liberty at all costs, there's nothing that I would dread doing more than having to pick up arms against a fellow American.
There is nothing I dread doing more than having to pick up arms against a fellow American. Dread doing more. That construction, plainly, right, is you dread a thing that you might have to do. You dread taking a test tomorrow. You dread having to deliver bad news. It's a thing you don't want to do but have to do. That's the construction the congressman used there about taking up arms against fellow Americans. And what he seems to be doing is encouraging more violent insurrection along the lines of January 6th. When asked to clarify his remarks, a spokesperson for the congressman said he was in no way supporting or advocating for any form of violence, and that Cawthorn was clearly advocating for violence not to occur over election integrity questions. But again, that's not what he said. What he said was that if things get bad enough, then people might have to take up arms. I would do it. I will do it, but I dread to. It's the last thing I want to do. I want to avoid that by dealing with election security. And let's be clear, the dealing with election security he and others are talking about is making sure Democrats don't win elections, because there was no breach of security in last November's presidential election. It's one thing when some red-faced, vein-popping rage addict screams at someone or at a camera, like that dude that we saw at the meeting there, or at a local school board or some public hearing. It's bad enough. It's a little embarrassing for them, but bad enough as it is. It's another thing altogether when a member of Congress flirts with the possibility of political violence from the American right towards the people the American right perceives to be its enemies, a member of Congress. That's how the big lie that the election was stolen works, and in this case it is leading to what sounds like a call for violence. Nearly 10 months after the election, this is still going on. They're not stopping. The delegitimization of Joe Biden, the big lie he was not actually elected, and this recourse to violence as a possible solution in a spectrum of solutions that lay out before us, well, it's happening amid rhetoric that's increasingly violent and militant and gun-obsessed, and seems to be getting stronger by the day, both in and outside our government.
He must go. He is a clear and present danger to the nation that we all love.
I'm going to Washington to stop the Pelosi agenda, and you're not going to silence me.
They don't care about protecting your freedom of speech, your right to bear arms, or even election security. They're more concerned about appeasing the left than they are standing up for us. Time to bring out the big guns. And the big guns are the millions of men and women in this country who feel as though their voices aren't being heard. I'll be your voice.
Again, both of those people are running for elected office. Now, imagine if you saw those ads from another country. It's like, oh, this is a slice of the democratic culture in this country. Just people with guns like that. What would you think? Look, a certain portion of Americans love their guns. American politicians have been posing with guns, well, mostly in ads for hunting, right, for years. But this feels different. It just does. It feels like intimidation. The presence of the gun in a political ad like that, the big guns, I'm going to shoot up Nancy Pelosi's socialism, alters the perception of what is being said in any context. And this is why what Congressman Madison Cawthorn said and what he's done should be disqualified. A sitting member of Congress raising the specter of violence, of civil war, of taking up arms against fellow Americans, a thing he dreads doing if future presidential elections do not go his way. He's not the only one. These sorts of intimations of violence, threats of violence, have become increasingly common among a certain faction of the Republican Party. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia seemingly suggests that people encouraging others to get vaccinated should be shot. To Congressman Matt Gaetz of Florida telling supporters the Second Amendment is for armed rebellion against the government. You know, it sounds hyperbolic to say it, but this is part of how peaceful liberal democracy is undone. When some group or party or institutions or groups of people within a society withdraw from the political sphere of argument and debate, and they move forward with fantasies of violence and violent insurrection. Congressman Adam Schiff is a member of January 6th Select Committee. He was the lead impeachment manager in Trump's first impeachment. He's the chair of the House Intelligence Committee as well, and he joins me now. What do you think about what your colleague Madison Cawthorn said?
Well, it's so irresponsible, it's hard to imagine, but this is really a continuation of the big lie. What he is saying is if elections continue to be rigged, he may find it necessary to take up arms. Well, of course, the election wasn't rigged. So what he's really saying is if he continues to propagate the lies about our election, it may lead him to bear arms to confront his own lies. And this is the danger that led us into January 6th, the propagation of falsehoods about our election, the glorifying of political violence, the urging other people potentially to violence. And it couldn't be more reprehensible. But it's also reflective of this new generation of Republican members of Congress that came to Congress, basically each of them trying to scream louder than the other, trying to get their 15 minutes of fame for being more outlandish than the other, all devoted to tearing down the institutions of government and never making the transition to governing in any way. And it's just an incredibly dangerous trend for the country.
You mentioned January 6th. Of course, you're on the Select Committee. Yesterday, we got news the Select Committee is, I don't know if preparing or has already sent out requests to telecom companies for the communications that include some members of Congress. First, I want to ask you, I'm going to read the statement that Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy issued. But first, I just want to ask you, do you have any wariness about this line? Do you have any worry? Was there discussion in the committee about what precedent this might set to be getting phone records from fellow members of Congress?
Certainly we've discussed the range of requests that we're making, and without getting into any of the particulars of our conversation, we looked at the historic precedent, and there is precedent for seeking records relating to members of Congress, most often in the context of ethics investigations. Well, I think participating in an insurrection, an armed insurrection against the government, is among the most serious ethics violations you could imagine, if not more than that. But yes, we did consider it. And I think that at the end of the day, we're determined that whoever was involved in this effort to prevent the peaceful transfer of power should not be able to hide behind their office. We want to develop all the facts. If people were not involved in trying to overturn the government, they shouldn't be concerned. But Kevin McCarthy clearly is, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is his boss, his master in Mar-a-Lago, doesn't want it to happen.
I will read you now the statement he issued in full because it mentions you, and I want to get your response to it. He says, Adam Schiff, Benny Thompson, and Nancy Pelosi's attempts to strong-arm private companies to turn over individuals' private data would put every American with a phone or computer in the crosshairs of a surveillance state run by Democrat politicians. If these companies comply with the Democrat order to turn over private information, they are in violation of federal law, subject to losing their ability to operate in the United States. If companies still choose to violate federal law, a Republican majority will not forget and will stand with Americans to hold them fully accountable under the law. This is not a threat of violence, but it is certainly a threat that he is making in response to this.
Well, it's a threat, and it's a threat premised on a falsehood. That somehow asking these companies to preserve records or ultimately to turn over records of people involved in an insurrection is somehow against the law. That's just flat wrong. But McCarthy, look, he's scared. And I think his boss is scared. They didn't want this commission and this select committee to go forward. They certainly didn't want it to go forward as it is on a bipartisan basis. And they don't want the country to know exactly what they were involved in. And you can see why. I mean, these two stories are not unrelated to each other. His caucus, his conference members are people like Cawthorn, who are still pushing the big lie that resulted in the insurrection to begin with. They're still pushing a big lie that may result in further violence in the future. The last thing Kevin McCarthy wants to do is take on these rabble-rousers in his conference because, frankly, they represent Donald Trump. And Kevin McCarthy lives to do whatever Donald Trump wants. But he is trying to threaten these companies, and it shows yet again why this man, Kevin McCarthy, can never be allowed to go anywhere near the Speaker's office.
That's right. Well said.
Asking you